A while back, I did a whole bunch of videos reviewing series and archetypes. If you remember, I did videos on the trap hole cards and the solemn cards and even things like the pot spell cards. But in today's video, I want to do something a little bit different. We're going to be reviewing monster cards this time, and we're going to review every single Kuriboh monster card. Now, there are a lot of Kuriboh monster cards, so we're only going to review half of them in this video, half of them in a part 2 a couple days from now. But this is very exciting because you might think, if you just look at the regular Kuriboh, that there aren't a ton of competitive Kuriboh monsters, but actually there are several that have seen competitive play in the TCG, and even more that have seen play in Duel Links, which I'll sort of mention as we go along here. In today's video, we're mostly going to be focusing on how competitive each Kuriboh card was in the TCG, though. Many of these cards are interesting and cool, but I only want to focus on how competitive the cards were. Starting off with the initial, original Kuriboh itself. Now, this card in particular isn't actually that strong, but it does set up a lot of things for the later Kuribohs. It sets up the stats of the card, the attack, the defense, the level, not so much the attribute and type. Those seem to change from Kuriboh to Kuriboh, but it is the first Kuriboh that comes before all of the rest of them. Just like in the case of Trap Hole when we did that video, just because the card isn't actually that strong doesn't mean that it's not significant. In the case of Kuriboh, without this card, we wouldn't have all these other cards to review, but this card in and of itself isn't that powerful. It has seen some experimentation in Kuriboh based strategies just because it is a dark monster that you can summon with the Flute of Summoning Kuriboh, but in general this is not one of the more powerful Kuribohs out there. Next up, we have Clear Kuriboh, and this card has two very different effects, although the first one is sort of paying homage to the original Kuriboh, and that's during either player's turn when your opponent activates a monster effect that would inflict damage, you can discard this card to negate the activation. Now, many of the Kuriboh cards that we're going to look at in today's video, as well as part 2, are going to negate damage or battle in some way, shape, or form, and that is true for both of the effects of Clear Kuriboh. So the first one negates effect damage, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but there are plenty of other cards that seem to do this in a much better fashion, such as Hain Wada, which doesn't negate the activation of a card, but it just prevents effect damage for the entire turn. So there are a ton of hand traps just like Clear Kuriboh, but actually end up being a lot better. So that effect isn't super relevant, it's mostly just relevant as a sort of side effect. The main effect of this card is that when it's in the graveyard and your opponent monster declares a direct attack, you can sort of banish it, draw a card, and then special summon it if it's a monster card. Now, in general, that effect is too random to actually be competitive, but it is pretty important in an actual dedicated Kuriboh strategy. Overall, though, Clear Kuriboh has not seen much competitive success just because in the case of both of its effects, while they are kind of on theme for Kuriboh monsters, they're not competitive enough to find a home in an actual viable strategy. A funny Kuriboh to come up after Clear Kuriboh is Junk Kuriboh, and when you read this card, you might understand why. This card only has one effect, and it is basically the exact same as Clear Kuriboh's first effect, which is already the lesser of the two effects on Clear Kuriboh. Junk Kuriboh is absolutely terrible. The only slight upgrade that it has from Clear Kuriboh's first effect is that it does destroy the card, but in general, most of the burn cards out there don't really care about being destroyed. This is just a card that is made strictly to make more Kuriboh cards. Konami really likes printing these with every single anime release. This does not have any competitive play and has not seen any experimentation at all. Obviously, if you want a card like this and you really want to play a Kuriboh monster, just play Clear Kuriboh, even though that card in and of itself isn't actually that powerful. It is much, much better than Junk Kuriboh. Next up, we have our first competitively viable Kuriboh monster, and that is Bandit. Now, this card saw a ton of play in 2014 when it was released in Dragons of Legend, and for a good reason. It does something that not many other cards do, and that's that it gives you a chance to quote-unquote search out the unsearchable spells and trap in your deck. Obviously, this is on a delay, and obviously it can be negated by commonly played cards like Breakthrough Skill, but in general, this is an excellent way to get those unsearchable cards to your hand, or at the very least it was back in 2014. This card saw play in a variety of strategies. Decks like Sylvans could add powerful spells to their hand like Soul Charge while sending a ton of monsters to their graveyard to set up that Soul Charge, but even decks that were spell and trap card heavy like Hat decks would play Curry Bandit every once in a while just for some interesting plays with loading up the graveyard for cards like Call of the Haunted. This card saw so much play for about all of 2014, pretty much even through early 2015, that's when it kind of stopped getting played, right about when Necros came out, but up until that point this card just saw continuous play in a ton of strategies. Obviously in 2018 this card is a little bit too slow to see competitive play, but it still cemented itself in Yu-Gi-Oh's competitive history just because of the sheer amount of decks that actually played this card. Also, as a side note, even though this doesn't technically relate to why this card is good, this is one of the only Kuriboh monsters that does not have 300 attack or 200 defense. Interestingly enough, you'll find out in part 2, one of the other only Kuriboh monsters that doesn't have 300 attack and 200 defense is also a very competitive card. I'm not sure exactly what Konami was thinking when they made these cards with different stats than the normal Kuriboh monsters, but it certainly does sort of stand out to me when I'm looking at the list and noticing that 2 of the cards that have different stats end up being 2 of the best Kuriboh monsters out there. Obviously, this doesn't technically relate to why this card is good, like I just said, but it is still interesting to note. Next up, we have Kuriboh, and this is not a card that has seen a ton of competitive play. However, I do have to acknowledge the fact that this is one of the only reasons you should actually try playing a dedicated Kuriboh strategy. This card, if it was in any other archetype, would be absolutely ridiculous. However, because its effect, although admittedly is very good in a Kuriboh strategy, because it's limited to just Kuriboh monsters, it makes it a lot less powerful. However, the sheer value that you get from one Kuriboh is ridiculous, and if you're playing a Kuriboh deck, you definitely want to play 3 copies. This card is extremely powerful in a dedicated Kuriboh deck. The problem is that Kuriboh decks in and of themselves aren't actually that strong. However, in those strategies, this is by far one of the best cards. Even when a card is stuck in a sort of lesser known archetype or less powerful archetype, anytime it can actually have the potential to give a player a +5 in card advantage, it's definitely worth giving a second look at. If Kuribohs ever get really good support, expect Kuriboh to be extremely popular in those Kuriboh decks. Next up, we have one of the Kuriboh monsters from the 5Ds era, and that is Kuriboh. Now, to be fair, this card is absolutely terrible. It trades tempo for life points, and if you've learned anything from my videos, it's that tempo is a lot more important than life points. However, this card is adorable, so I will give its artwork a little shout out, but yeah, this card has not seen any competitive play. It's really bad. Don't play it. Photon is not that good of card. However, it is interesting because it is one of the only Kuriboh monsters that directly relates to an archetype outside of Kuribohs. Now, cards like Curry Bandit did see play in decks that weren't Kuribohs. However, this one is actually directly linked to the Photon monster. So first off, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard and pay 2,000 life points. You take no damage this turn. Now, the actual effect of this card is certainly better than Clear Kuriboh or regular Kuriboh or Junk Kuriboh because it prevents all damage, not just effect damage, not just battle damage. However, because you're paying 2,000 life points to get that effect, you actually have to be taking more than 2,000 effect damage or battle damage for this thing to be useful, and that's a pretty rare situation. Pretty much only when you'd be getting OTK'd is this card any good. And then it has a graveyard effect that lets you pitch a Photon monster from your hand and add it back to your hand. The problem with that effect isn't that it's a minus in card economy, because it's not. You just make a 1-for-1 trade. The problem is that 9 times out of 10 in a Photon or Galaxy deck, the Photon card that you're discarding is likely better than Photon, just because the impact of this card's discard effect is not high enough to ever want to add it back to your hand. Overall, this card isn't terrible, but it certainly isn't good enough to even see play in the more casual Photon strategies, so it's not going to be very highly ranked on this list. This card did not see any experience experimentation, even in Photon strategies, and likely never will. If it didn't have a life point cost, then maybe this card would be a cool tech option, but that 2,000 life points just ends up being way too high for such a low impact effect. And lastly, for today's video, we have Kuriboh, released in one of the earliest Exceeds monster expansions, and it says you can target one face of Exceed monster that has Exceed material, detach one material from it, and if you do, summon one Kurivolt from your deck. This card cannot be used as a synchro material monster. That last line actually kills this card because it might have been cool to make cards like Formula Synchron with it. However, because it can't be used for synchro materials, you have to use it only for tribute summons or other tributes or Exceed material. The problem is that, especially when this card came out, but even nowadays, there aren't a ton of good rank 1 monsters. Even the best rank 1 monsters, you'd be better off using other cards to get there, unlike this card, which not only requires you to have an Exceed monster on the board, but also get this out next to it, and also not care about detaching a material from the monster that you just summoned just to make a rank 1. There isn't really a strategy that this card goes in. Even the level 1 strategies that have sometimes played these Kuriboh cards, like Mystic Piper strategies of olden day, wouldn't ever want to play a card like this just because it has way too much setup for not enough payoff. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1 of reviewing all of the Kuriboh monsters. There's actually several competitive Kuriboh monsters in part 2, which is kind of interesting, so make sure to come back for that if you want to check out the rest of the Kuribohs. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.